This is Think Tank. I'm Jarrell DeMattis. Welcome to all of you in Trinidad and Tobago and around the world. When US Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy issued an advisory about social media's impact on youth mental health, he of course directly connected the potential harms that exposure to extreme, inappropriate, and harmful content had on the health and safety of children and youth. The connection is consistently established in research literature, as expressed in the Surgeon General's advisory. A bit closer to Trinidad and Tobago, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, researchers found a link between not just bullying and mental health outcomes, but also substance abuse and adverse behavioral outcomes. What is the place of our response in Trinidad and Tobago to this quite clear danger to our youth? Here's what I think. Our cultural interaction affects a much too casual approach to cyberbullying. Perhaps this is the reason why it isn't taken as seriously as it should. Perhaps also it is severely misunderstood by those in positions to create change. I'm referring particularly to those in educational institutions. Not to place the burden on teachers, having been a teacher myself, but those are the people in closest contact with children and adolescents, and therefore in the best position to educate on how to identify and treat with experiences of cyberbullying. The Curaçao National Commission for UNESCO understands this. In 2020, the Commission carried out an initiative that distributed anti-bullying toolkits and held follow-up workshops and training sessions for teachers, students, and parents. Of all the policy documents that exist on the Ministry of Education's website in Trinidad and Tobago, none explicitly deals with cyberbullying. This is shocking to say the least, given what is expected to be an increased usage of social media among young people. The risk of continuing to underestimate the wide-ranging effects of cyberbullying becomes even more stark if we consider that online abuse carries the possibility of leading to physical abuse. Another critical intervention lies in the area of legislation, specifically the cybercrime bill. This important piece of legislation, however, that can be an important step toward mitigating the effects of cyberbullying is complicated to say the least. This is due to the matter of interpretation, which, by imposing stronger language on what counts as cyberbullying, might unintentionally lead to an encroachment on certain rights, including the freedom of expression. What this all points to is a need to get both how we approach cyberbullying and how we define it. Our present moment demands that we get this right. Here with me today on Think Tank to discuss cyberbullying is Troy Smith, co-director of Targeted Evidence-Based Research Solutions. Let's get started. So Troy, Dr. Troy Smith, describe your academic journey in the field of social media and cyber victimization.
Originally, my work would have been focused on cybercrime victimization coming out of my PhD studies in terms of cybercrime victimization in Trinidad and Tobago, and being able to differentiate between cyber-enabled crimes and true cybercrimes, like hacking and so on, that are dependent on having an ICT infrastructure versus crimes that were traditional, like stalking, bullying, for example, that now have a cyber component. And coming out of that and having discussion with other people and knowing my interest in cyber, I had a discussion with regards to one of my family members and his stepson regarding the use of social media and his observations of the extent of emotional distress when he would have been banned from the use of social media. And this would have piqued my interest in terms of why is there such a strong attraction or a strong emotional bond between these adolescents and social media. I ended up on doing additional research. I saw it to be an emerging topic, but however, there was no research in the Caribbean region. So I took it on to start looking at that phenomenon within the Caribbean.
And what is the connection between social media and cyberbullying that perhaps we continue to take for granted?
The fact of the matter is that cyberbullying in itself is very pervasive and can be very insidious as a form of or a stressor to persons who are online. And if you look from the social media dimension of it and the patterns in social media use, you will see from the literature that persons who engage in extensive social media use are normally the persons who already suffer from loneliness, low self-esteem, and or consider themselves lacking acceptance or a sense of community within the real world space. Therefore, they go to social media seeking a level of engagement and a need affordance for acceptance. So when they leave a space where they're already feeling isolated and then go to social media and then encounter bullying on that platform also, it means now that they have no direction in which to turn to seek that sense of acceptance and community, meaning that there is no turning point which could lead to such levels of stress that they exhibit suicidal ideation and tendencies. And when we think about bullying online, the common joke online is basically, so why these persons can't just turn off the computer, right? Which seems the simple solution. However, them turning off the system doesn't really mean that the cyberbullying stops. It means that they don't necessarily see the direct posting in relation to the bullying, but all of the persons who are their connections in the real world who also use the same space are still seeing the comments of the bully. And there's some transition from the cyberspace now back into the real space in terms of the comments and the effects of those comments on the target. And unlike in the real space where it may be something written on a wall and the wall could be repainted or washed, things in cyberspace tend to be very permanent. There's a high level of permanency in cyberspace, and it's very difficult to hide or get rid of it, even in terms of engaging the social media provider themselves. And another critical rule from the standpoint of the threat actor is that social media in itself, just like the internet, has a large factor of anonymity and disengagement, and then persons have online personas, and they now feel empowered to engage in particular activities while online. So you have persons who would not have been bullies in the real world space because of their concern for the consequences. But because of the sense of anonymity online, these social personas, they tend to be more readily accepting of their darker sides, their sense of sadism or narcissism, and then engage in these attack behaviors against other persons.
You raise an interesting point. I like that. You said something to the effect of you found that those who use social media more already face, let's say, issues of acceptance. So is it then something that needs to happen before those particular users engage with social media? So should we also focus on that aspect then of social media usage among those who experience issues of acceptance of belonging?
Yes, so this is something that I often highlight in my articles, is that social media or problematic social media use is not necessarily the psychosocial problem itself. It is a result of other psychological issues or psychopathologies. So persons who already suffer from loneliness, who already suffer from low self-esteem, who have trouble interacting offline, will then go on social media seeking these forms of gratification and needs affordance. So in trying to treat with social media addiction, yes, there are manifestations of that we need to deal with, but we need to recognize that there are underlying mechanisms that lead to the problematic use. And in order to truly deal with that, we need to recognize and deal with those issues, which are social issues, which means that there's a need for counseling and a higher or increase in the amount of persons suffering from problematic use could really be a sign of increased loneliness and low self-esteem within the adolescent population, meaning that we need to target the schools and create mechanisms for those persons to be able to identify those issues and have someone with which they could interact to help build their confidence, build their ability to interact, and give them other ways to deal with those issues rather than turn into social media.
Mm.
Especially in a era right now where we know there's a development of a like culture, meaning that persons are increasingly associating self-worth and acceptance with the amount of likes that they get, the amount of attention that they get online, which also means now that they are more susceptible to being hurt or suffer psychological harm when attacked online, as that seems to be a major space for the social interaction.
I find it fascinating the language associated with different social media platforms. So there's the like culture, there's the follow culture of Instagram and Twitter, there's the connect culture of LinkedIn. And they essentially carry the same sort of connotations. As someone though involved, so closely involved with cyber victimization, I'm sure the developments in social media would have been fascinating to you. So can you give us a sort of trajectory of your earliest publication to the most recent and any changes you've noticed among your publications with respect to the issues that emerge?
So if we're looking more specifically at the social media side of it,
Yeah.
I would say that one of the early observations, because one of my very first papers would have looked at Facebook and TikTok, and it would have identified that in terms of the manifestation of the addiction-like responses, the key aspects would have been tolerance and mood modification, meaning that you would have been seeing a clear increase in the level of engagement of persons on social media who are heading towards the problematic use. And that the main reason for them increasing usage was to modify mood, which links back to the low sense of loneliness and the low self-esteem. All right, so again, we are seeing where the social and psychological problems in the real world are what are pushing them to use of the social media. What would have also been identified as progressed through the research is that different social media platforms have different levels of persons having tendencies towards problematic use based on the different formats. Of course, you would have seen, even in the layman terms, that persons started to shift away from Facebook to Instagram and then from Instagram to TikTok because of the changes in the trend towards a greater focus on self-presentation, which again links back to the drivers, because the persons who lack a sense of acceptance and a community desire a medium where they can carefully present themselves in a way that they feel that would be accepted by more persons, hence leading to that whole likes and a positive feedback loop, which increases tolerance and even salience, in that the more likes they get, the more attention they get, is the more they want to interact with social media so they could get even more attention and more likes to have a more increased positive feeling. Right, so there's a positive feedback loop taking place there until it reaches a stage where the increase in usage is no longer proportional to the amount of likes, and that's when you step into the problematic zone.
Research.
Mhm.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that just to give an idea, in general, when you look at social media as a whole rather than specific platforms, from what I've seen in the research in the Caribbean, is often around 20% of persons exhibiting sufficient usage to be considered as being problematic.
How can we translate, how can an activist, for example, reading your work, use that to their own advocacy and really advocacy throughout the public, because we can all become advocates for children and young people who are cyber victimized. So what link do
Mm,
you see between your research and activism that we can perhaps lean on heavily?
yeah. So to start off with, the research demonstrate that there is actually a real measurable problem. Because saying that there's a problem based on observation is one thing.
Yeah.
But when you actually collect the data empirically and you implement the skills to identify the patterns, it's easier to substantiate those claims. And we see that um, when you look more closely, another key concern, especially now where we are more concerned with gender and so on, there are gender differences in social media addiction and social media high levels of engagement with it favoring females, which also can now link back to other discussions and other discourse to support the argument for increased focus in the area, because you would recognize that concepts link back to self-presentation and the images of persons on social media with a particular look, a particular weight, and the false representation of themselves in terms of what is idyllic leads to a negative sense of self-worth in females in often and is demonstrated in literature.
Mhm.
And it can lead to suicidal ideation. It could lead to extensive unnecessary dieting. It could lead to increase in plastic surgery, which is the case in the US, and other similar factors. Another key issue is that the research highlights the underlying psychological forces that lead to the social media misuse, which means now that it's not just a problem of technology, but it is a social and health problem, right? So when advocating for greater focus on social media is not just about the outcomes in itself, but also being able to identify that there are key social slash health factors that need to be taken into account that leads to these outcomes. And I know you would have mentioned in your intro, um, in terms of the effect on sports and so on. And there's a long list of effects of social media, problematic use in terms of decreased academic performance, decreased sleep, decreased sport performance, breakdown of relationships, right?
Yeah.
Generally due to the signs of addiction, which are conflict, because persons around you're going to identify that you're going to be using this platform excessively, and you're going to argue that that's not the case, and you're going to try to move away from them. The increased use of itself means that even at the nighttime, you're going to want to be on social media rather than sleeping. So you're going to develop bad sleep patterns, and that's going to affect your ability to perform in school, your ability to perform in sports, and even in case of adults, to perform in work.
Mhm.
So we are seeing clear linkages in terms of advocacy of the cause and the effect side to show why there is a need for increased engagement in this particular area.
As a researcher, you would attempt for you would try for objectivity. But I
Mhm.
want to know your opinions in terms of now we have this research, you produce this research. What, in your opinion, needs to change in Trinidad and Tobago regarding how we treat with social media usage, cyber victimization, and the like? Because I imagine our own cultural nuances would require a cultural
Mm.
specific approach. So what opinions do you have around that?
So first of all, we need to actually recognize that the problem exists, especially from the social media side. From the cybercrime victimization side, we know it exists. But do we recognize the seriousness of it in terms of the outcomes, in terms of cyberbullying and so on? And once we recognize that, we need to be able to develop the robust frameworks and the corresponding laws to support police action with regards to that. Because if we recognize that these are crimes or forms of deviance, there must be some repercussion, some penalty associated with that. Of course, trying to balance the need to protect human rights in the process. And linked to that is an increased sense of awareness for both citizens and law enforcement and the judiciary system, because the public can't recognize that a problem exists in terms of cyber. Say somebody's being bullied online and then they go to report it to the law enforcement and the law enforcement doesn't see it as a serious issue.
Yeah.
Or the person in the charge room is not sure who to refer a case like that to. And then the police are then limited to by what they can do because there's no dedicated law for those cyber crimes. So if you're bullying somebody or you're posting inaccurate information online, you have to go back to crimes against the person because there's no specific crime called cyberbullying on the law books.
Mhm.
So this creates a space for these forms of criminality. Of course, law enforcement is doing their best to utilize the laws that exist to prosecute those persons. But of course, if they're given the correct tools by creating those laws, they'll be able to do more. And it would encourage the powers that be within the police service now to train the general officers to understand at least the basics of cybercrime, the basics of cyberbullying, so they could better engage with the public.
There also seems to be, I like that point about the training because that's a necessary step to recognizing, but also treating with. I'm also inclined to um, put forward the prospect of a policy that actually deals with cyberbullying and something that um, addresses in a written format in a document and outline the pressing need to address it. So has this been something you have come across in terms of your own research and a possible way to advocate for better social media usage as well as responses to cyber victimization in terms of a policy on cyberbullying?
Well, that is something that is a bit touchy in the sense that, as you would have identified, given the nature of the activities associated with bullying, especially in cyberspace, it is very controversial in terms of the wording and the defining of cyberbullying and not having going across into the area of affecting human rights and the right to free speech, etc. Most often in the UK, the US, you will see it being covered in existing harassment and communication laws.
Yeah.
I know when they were doing the last set of revisions for the cybercrime bill locally, the head of the Joint Select Committee at the time, which I believe was Mr. Arawi, would have made recommendations for the addition of um, malicious communications, right, as being one dimension of dealing with the posting of inaccurate information, which could defame or bring someone into a negative light based on that information. So there are attempts locally to do so, and those things can be embedded in existing laws with the amendments or included in the upcoming cybercrime bill. There should be some policy in terms of the schools, in terms of how they may also be able to deal with it.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that the cyberbullying doesn't stop in cyberspace. There will always be some transition from the cyberspace back into the physical space. Because the whole point of why the bullying in cyberspace has power is that the persons who the target knows offline are also in that space.
Yeah.
And the primary space for the adolescents will be in the school forum. Yes?
Yeah.
So I agree with you. And I also recognize that efforts are being made, and it is something that takes some necessary thought. It's something that would have been raised recently in Barbados, while because they are also doing their cybercrime um, act right now. And that particular issue of cyberbullying was a issue that caused one of the issues rather that caused the bill to stall and is being reviewed right now.
Would you support, say, an addition to the National School of Conduct, for example, is not a law, but at least
Mhm.
some that document that sufficiently, you know, explains and lays out forms of cyberbullying, what it looks like, and how to address it.
Mhm.
Do you think that that's a good place to start in terms of getting the schools on board, for example?
I would say in terms of education or
Mhm.
awareness and being able to communicate reports to law enforcement more than they directly engaging in attempting to stop the activity because of the mere fact that they will have an even greater issue than what law enforcement has in terms of identifying who and how.
Yeah.
Because remember, there's a sense of anonymity on cyberspace. I could post something with another name, and then somebody else comes in school and say, this guy is posting this information about me. But how do I prove that it's really this particular person? And that is a problem that you have at the law enforcement level. So that at the school level, but even higher. So when we put that in writing, it means that we are putting this additional strain on the schools without the resources to actually do something about it.
Yeah.
So why we would want to put something in place to ensure that there is some type of awareness taking place in the school, just like we have with normal bullying, and might want to create a mechanism for them to communicate with law enforcement. Putting the charge on them to deal with it may not be the best way forward. And I will also take the opportunity to highlight that this brings back the consideration of the need for social workers in the school, because those social workers might be the easiest point of contact for persons who are experiencing any form of bullying to come and communicate the issues that they are having and also be able to start dealing with some of the outcomes of that bullying.
Mhm.
And even before they end up online in terms of the social media addiction part of it, that those underlying issues of loneliness and so on may be dealt with at that level. Because we're also trying to prevent all the other downstream issues that might occur.
Yeah, you're right. Before we put something into writing, we need to ensure that we have the resources to
Mm.
to deal with the potential outcomes of that. Dr. Troy Smith, thank you very much for being part of our think tank.
It was my pleasure, and I hope that I give some good information to the audience that they can look forward and have a more critical look of cyberbullying and problematic social media use. And thank you
Absolutely.
very much for having me and for the invitation.
Absolutely. And to everyone watching and listening, thank you for being part of our think tank as well.